Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to our public forum, the ISIS public forum today, Peace Talks in Southern Thailand, Pathways, Obstacles and Prospects. Before I begin, please allow me to introduce Professor Dr. Supachai Yawaprapad, the Dean of the Faculty of Political Science, and he will provide some welcoming remarks.
Good morning, everyone, Excellencies, distinguished guests, and the audience. As the Dean of the Political Science, I'm here to welcome the speaker and to thank the speaker who come here to share with us their thought on this important topic, and also to welcome all the audience. I think every time ISIS have a public forum like this, the issue always very interesting, and we always gather quite a big audience like this. So I think we have only about 2 hours and a half to hear, to listen, and to share. So I will stop here. I'm here to welcome you and hope that you will enjoy the public forum. Thank you very much.
I wish that we wouldn't have to organize this forum on the South again, but because of the intractability now, it seems there has not been enough progress. The peace talks have stalled, and the way ahead is very murky. So today I want to thank first of all the speakers, and then our sponsor today is Frederick Naumann Stiftung. I don't know if they're here today. One of them is here today. So thank you very much to FNS for sponsoring us. I want to introduce the Dream South project that the FNS has been doing in the Deep South, and I've been involved in it as well, trying to get the young people in the South, in the Deep South, 3 southernmost provinces, to think about the future 10 years from now, what kind of place, what kind of home they would like to have, and to try to move in that direction. So today we're joined, and I'll introduce him as a first speaker, not as first speaker, but as one of the speakers, by a young man named Danyal. So he's part of this project, the Dream South project. The other speakers we have today are very distinguished, and most of you will know them already, at least their names and their work. Mr. Matt Wheeler of the International Crisis Group. International Crisis Group has been closely tracking, analyzing, writing about the Deep South. And then Don Pathan writes a column in The Nation, and he also does a lot of consulting projects, research projects related to the South Insurgency. And Srisompob Jitpiromsri, he is the head of the Thai Deep South Watch, but he's also part of the Thai negotiation team. So he knows, he's not a negotiator, but he's a consultant, advisor on the Thai side. So he knows some of the inside issues, discourse, and concerns that they have from the Thai side. They have all traveled from different places here, so I really want to thank all of them. Now, the South is now going to be, the violence that we have, a decade old. I mean, it's a century long, but a decade old flare-up of the violence since January 2004. More than 5,300 have died from this violence. It's now the top 5 deadliest internal conflict in the world. The numbers are not very rosy. In fact, they are depressing. The patterns, the frequency, the actual death toll. We have a couple of papers that I've included along with the sign-up materials. I want to thank Bangkok Pundit. This is a pseudonym for a very popular web blog analyzing Thai politics and also Thai South. He's come up with some figures and numbers. That's very helpful. So we have that in hand. I've asked for permission to disseminate that. We also have Matt Wheeler's latest ICG report. So you have something in writing as well to go back and digest on. And today you will hear from the experts or the people who actually are on the ground themselves. The problem that we have in the Deep South, one of the many problems, is that we have a distraction and division in Bangkok. So the big news in Bangkok today is not about the South, it's about the amnesty bill and the brinkmanship that we're going to see in the days ahead. This has been a problem because it has not allowed for a consensus and a full-hearted effort to tackle the Southern insurgency, to promote and make way on the peace process. So many issues out there on the peace process itself, and I'll be interested to hear from our experts. I'm not sure if we're speaking to the right people, and I've said this all along, and I'm not sure if the right people are speaking on our side, who needs to be on our side, on the Thai side speaking, and then on the insurgent side speaking, under what conditions, and also the facilitator, mediator is Malaysia. And Malaysia is certainly has to be included, but perhaps would it be possible, or is it warranted to consider other facilitators, mediators? So these are some of the issues that I want to prompt the speakers with. Now let's go ahead with the first presentation, the first talk by Matt Wheeler. We have rearranged the lineup a little bit, so Matt Wheeler will speak first. And I think as a contrast, by contrast, Don Pathan will follow, and then Ajahn Srisompob. And with Danyal, there will be some translation, and I'll have to be your unsolicited translator, because he needs a little bit of assistance, but he has some very insightful things to say from the ground. Matt Wheeler.
I'm going to talk about some of the things that I think the dialogue process has going for it. That is strong points that I think could lead to some success eventually from this process. I'm going to identify some of the purported or alleged problems that have been identified with the process, and which I think can be assessed in at least a couple of different ways. I'm going to note a couple of what I see as genuine problems with the process, and then conclude by making just a couple of observations. But I want to start by at least acknowledging a couple of contentious points. Ajahn Thitinan has alluded to some of them already. The first is the degree of willingness on the part of BRN leaders to negotiate at this point in time. And most of my comments proceed on the basis that there is a sufficient degree of willingness for the process to proceed. I think one thing that's worth noting is that the demands, the 5 demands that have been elaborated by BRN have been very carefully framed as being consonant with the Thai Constitution. Another point of contention is the degree of control exerted by militant leaders in Malaysia over fighters on the ground in Thailand. This is a point of disagreement among some analysts and observers of the conflict. And I think there's probably consensus on the point that it's a very decentralized movement, but not really a consensus on whether there's a reliable system of command and control that would make decisions taken by militant leaders in exile to be meaningful on the ground in Thailand. I'll put my cards on the table. My view is that it's not likely that the most effective militant organization, the most effective insurgency in Thai history is the result of spontaneous or ad hoc actions. But this doesn't mean that decisions taken by leadership in Malaysia on issues related to the dialogue process, related to a resolution of the conflict, or desirable political outcomes would necessarily be acted upon by fighters inside Thailand. I think these are issues that can be disaggregated. There's also the issue, as Ajahn Thitinan pointed out, of are we talking to the right people? And my view has long been that the Thai side doesn't have a lot of choice in this matter. They have to talk to the people who are willing to talk to them. And I think, at least in the beginning, the important thing is to try to build a process that can endure, and then try to bring more people into the dialogue process. So what does the process have going for it? Well, some things are simple facts, and one of those is that the dialogue is a matter of policy for the Thai government. It's codified in the National Security Policy for the Administration and Development of the Southern Border Provinces. This was a policy that started drafting under the Democrat Party-led government, and it's been approved by Parliament. So there shouldn't be any concern about whether this is an appropriate undertaking. It's a matter of settled policy. The Royal Thai government has recognized BRN as one of the stakeholders in the process, and I think it's well established that this is unprecedented and a huge step forward for finding a way to manage the conflict. Another point is that BRN is now articulating demands. We should remember that for years, for most of this renewed conflict, the militants really didn't articulate in any formal way what they were attempting to achieve. So this is another great step forward in trying to find a solution, and something that I think shouldn't be minimized. I think the process has also worked to encourage the militant side to articulate a political agenda, and I think it's probably work that continues to be undertaken by the militant side, and I think that's another benefit that we've seen from the process so far. There's still a long way to go, but I think there's been some movement in that direction, which is also welcome. Another thing is the determination that's been manifest on the part of the Thai government to keep the process going. There have been repeated statements from Lieutenant General Pathan of the National Security Council that the dialogue process will proceed. And this has been consistent even in the face of some pretty shattering setbacks. I think it's also worth noting that some high-level dialogue skeptics were sidelined or dropped from the cabinet in the last reshuffle. I'm thinking of Chalerm Yubongrum, who was the Deputy Prime Minister for Security Affairs, and also Defense Minister Songkla. So I think this is something worth noting. I want to turn now to some of the purported or alleged problems with the dialogue process that have been identified by a variety of people. I don't want to say that all of these alleged problems don't have any merit. I think there's merit to some of them, and there's degrees of merit to some of the criticisms, but I think they can also be looked at in a variety of ways. The first one that was identified very early on was the involvement of former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra in initiating the process. I think it's probably not that difficult to identify some self-serving or cynical motivations for Thaksin's involvement, but I think that political expediency isn't necessarily a bad thing when it comes to initiating a very difficult process like this. And it's not necessarily at odds with progress toward an eventual solution to the conflict. I think it's also the case that some proportion of the Malay-Muslim population sees Thaksin as less rigid and perhaps less invested in the existing status quo in the South, and therefore perhaps more willing to accept alternative governance arrangements than his political opponents in the Democrat Party. Another issue is Malaysia's role. The criticism is that Malaysia is too close to the conflict and can't possibly be an impartial party, and so it's not appropriate as a facilitator. I think there is some merit in this criticism, but I think at a practical level we have to recognize that Malaysia is probably the only entity that has any real leverage over the militants, and without their involvement we may not have had any process to talk about today. I think it's probably true that what leverage they have needs to be very carefully calibrated going forward, especially. But I think Malaysia has an interest in the outcome, and I think that can help to keep the process on track over time. Also, Malaysia is willing to play this role. So it's a matter of going with the resources that are available. And I think most importantly, Thailand, as well as at least some of the militants, have recognized that Malaysia has to be a part of a resolution to the conflict. There's no other way. It's another issue is that it's sometimes lamented that the Thai public at large is not engaged in the conflict. The conflict does not impinge on the consciousness of Thai people outside of the region. And so they're not concerned about it, not invested in finding a solution. I have a feeling that this apathy could actually be constructive, at least in the near term. I think this issue, the issue of conflict in the Deep South, generates a lot less nationalist and partisan heat than does, for example, the issue of conflict over Khao Phra Vihan or Phra Vihear on the Cambodian border. And I think if we look at the impact of that sentiment on policy, on the way decisions are made, I think we can see that the fact that that is absent with respect to the South gives the Thai government more room for maneuver, which I think is useful, especially early on. Sometimes the process is criticized for the fact that there's still violence, and I think that this criticism is based on perhaps a poor understanding of how dialogue works, how peace processes work. There have only been 3 plenary sessions of the joint working group so far. I think that's important to keep in mind. We're still very early in the process. We should also recognize that violence is the only real leverage that the militants have, and so they can't be expected to give it up too easily. I think we have to also recognize that a reduction in violence or an end to violence is one of the things that the process is meant to achieve. So you don't get to reap the rewards without doing the labor first. So this is something that needs to be achieved as an outcome. It doesn't come at the beginning of the process. So I'm going to turn now to some of the things that I think are genuinely problematic for the process. And again, Ajahn Thitinan has identified some of these already. Disunity on both sides of the table. I think the disunity that's evident on the Thai side is an old problem. At this point, it's also partly political, but it's also a function of how the bureaucracy operates. And the quest for unity in the implementation of policy is something that's been a constant issue since at least the mid-1960s. Certainly, some in the security forces and in the Ministry of Interior and other government agencies have expressed discomfort with the dialogue process. In their eyes, engaging in the dialogue has raised the status of BRN. And they really are fearful of a couple of things. One is outside intervention by international organizations or third countries. And the other is the introduction of special administrative arrangements, which in their view could be a stepping stone to independence, a loss of sovereignty, and of course this is unacceptable in their eyes. But the official position of the Thai government right now is that the Constitution does provide for decentralization of political power. So discussion of possible models, alternative models of administration for the South is not out of bounds. Sometimes officials who are supportive of the process will describe objections registered by, for example, senior Army officers as just an expression of different opinions. But I think that given the national level political tensions that exist today, there really is potential for a severe rift that could jeopardize the dialogue going forward. I think another problem is that the militant movement, whether it be BRN or other militant organizations, still need to demonstrate that they have the legitimacy that they claim to have as representatives of the Malay-Muslim population. How to do this is an enormous challenge, but it's not an unprecedented challenge in these kinds of processes. But it's something that needs to be done. And as part of that, the militant movement will have to do more work on articulating its political vision. And without doing that, I think what's left is militants who are perpetrating violence to no real end. And I don't think that that's actually the case. I'm just saying that there needs to be more work done on the political side. The lack of trust is a huge problem, and I think it's probably best overcome by continuing the process. I think the perceptions on both sides about the utility of dialogue are still at odds. And this is something that was, I think, addressed very neatly and concisely in a draft policy paper by the Patani peace process that noted that the Thai side views the dialogue process as a way to reduce the violence, whereas BRN looks at the talks as fundamentally about the need for the Thai side to acknowledge the historical and cultural and political roots of the conflict. I think it's certainly legitimate to air these kinds of grievances in a dialogue process, but at a certain point, and hopefully soon, they need to find a common agenda. And I think that the 5 points that have been proposed or demanded by BRN, that have been elaborated by BRN and have subsequently been discussed by the Thai government, could form the basis of an agenda. The National Security Council and the security sector has looked at these demands, and from my understanding, they've determined that they do not necessarily conflict with the Constitution, so they can serve as a basis for further discussion. There's some controversy about the fourth demand, which touches on issues of sovereignty and self-determination, but I gather that there is a recognition on both sides that that is an issue that will have to be tackled later, after more confidence has been built and more trust developed, and I think that that's probably sound. So I'm just going to conclude with a couple of observations. The first is that we're a long way still from a discussion of substantive issues. I think the matter at hand is still trying to build a secure and stable process, and even that is going to take time. A more basic issue that I think needs to be addressed is we need to ask if those who have vested interest in the status quo or those who have uncompromising positions right now truly believe that there's nothing more to be gained by violence. And unfortunately, I think the answer to that question right now is not yet. So that's something that needs to be overcome somehow. And I think probably best through talking more. Another issue is that it remains to be seen if the Thai state is really able to decentralize effectively, or even to accept some of the administrative changes that, in my view, at least stand a chance of diffusing the sources of conflict. I think only time will tell, and I think that actually the passage of time could serve, to make those sorts of changes more plausible and more palatable. So the focus now needs to be on clarifying the substantive issues that the dialogue process needs to address. They need to set priorities. They need to agree on confidence-building measures. There needs to be a stronger agreement about how information is shared between parties and is disseminated. And of course, there needs to be mechanisms for civil society and for outside expertise to help inform the process. Finally, I think we can't dismiss the possibility that a durable process, just by its persistence, can generate some changes in the dynamics or in the atmosphere that wouldn't have occurred absent the process. So what I'm trying to say is that I think the process can be seen as a good in itself. So there have been mistakes with this process for sure. There's going to be more mistakes. But I think the important thing now is that there's a willingness to learn from those mistakes and to carry the process forward. I think there's much more to be lost from not carrying it forward than there's more to be lost from not carrying it forward than not, if you follow me. Thank you.
I want to have a follow-up question before you turn the microphone away. You spoke about time. So what are the immediate mechanics? There are a lot of loose parts here. I mean, the constellation of the different parts are all loose and contradictory. What are the immediate steps that both sides need to take to set up the right arrangement or conducive environment? And how long are we talking about? I mean, this is a very short time, only 3 plenaries, as you mentioned, but Philippines, it took more than 3 years of intense monthly dialogue. Indonesia, also years. So are we talking about some years now? If so, then we have to really pace ourselves. And my other question is the concern about continuity in Thailand. If we have a change of government, we change the negotiation team, and what would happen?
Yeah. I don't have a great answer to your question about time. I don't know how long it's going to take, but my view is however long it takes, that's how much time you invest in it. I think the alternatives suggest that it needs to be done, so take the time to do it. I suggested some of the things that need to be done. I think working on how information is disseminated probably should be high on the agenda, because I think some of the ways that information has been shared probably not conducive to a good environment for talks. So if this can be achieved, I think it will have a more immediate effect on allowing the talks to be more productive. Yeah, your second question was about stakeholders, and I think that's a really important point. And it's something that I guess, in terms of the way I divided my talk, I would put under genuine problems. Because from the perspective of the militants, there's probably not great incentive necessarily to make any compromises or reach any sort of agreement given the uncertainty that persists at the national level in Thailand. And there's not a whole lot, I think, that can be done about that. Certainly the militants can't do anything about it. I'm not sure that the government can do much about it. Well, I mean, there's some things that they could do, I think, to calm the tensions, but they've got priorities, right? And I think it's safe to say that while they've invested a lot in getting this process started, it's not the main the main show.
Okay, thank you. So peace talks are difficult and delicate at the same time, but your main point is that at least this is the road ahead, one way or the other, ultimately.